The hum of the airplane engines is constant, a dull thrum beneath your feet, the kind of sound that usually fades into the background, reassuring you that everything is just as it should be. But not today. Today, the hum seems louder, more insistent, like a warning. You've boarded this plane with a sense of calm, ready for a routine flight to New York, a simple transition from one moment to the next. But as you make your way down the aisle, everything shifts in an instant. You reach your seat, first class, 2C, exactly where you should be. The seat you paid for, the seat that's supposed to be yours. And then you see him. A man, mid-40s, casually lounging in the seat, his coat thrown carelessly over the armrest, his shoes kicked off, his drink in hand. His posture screams entitlement, like he's been here forever, like he belongs here more than anyone else. There's no rush to stand, no hesitation when you approach. He doesn't even seem to notice the small disruption he's causing. You clear your throat. "Excuse me," you begin, voice calm but firm. "I believe that's my seat." He looks up from his drink, almost surprised you've spoken at all. A slight, dismissive smile forms on his lips, and without missing a beat, he responds. "I think you're mistaken," he says, his tone casual, almost bored. "This is my seat." The flight attendants hover nearby, but they don't move toward you. They don't rush in to correct the situation. They don't even ask for your boarding pass. They just stand there, their silence loud in the still air, as if they're unsure whether this is really a problem worth addressing.
Your heart beats a little faster now. The cabin, once a quiet escape from the world, suddenly feels a little smaller, a little more claustrophobic. You glance around, noticing the others. Some watch, some pretend not to notice, and some avoid eye contact completely. And now, here's the question. What do you do? Do you raise your voice? Do you fight for your seat, your space, your dignity? Or do you walk away, letting him take what you've earned, what you paid for, simply because he thinks he deserves it more than you? This isn't just about a seat on a plane. This is about power. The kind that some people think they can claim without ever having to ask for permission. This is about the assumption that, because of who he is, he's entitled to take what's yours. It's about the quiet moments of conflict, when you have to decide whether to stand up, speak out, or let it slide. Because sometimes, the battles we face are invisible. And sometimes, they don't even look like battles until you stand your ground.
Welcome back, my beautiful family and friends. If you're hooked in and you're ready to enjoy this story, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one, and you don't want to miss it. If you don't want to subscribe, kindly tell us why in the comments section. We will love to know. Now, let us begin. But this isn't just any woman in this moment. This is Ariel Monroe, a Black woman CEO, calm and composed, strong and dignified, with a presence that commands the room without her saying a word. She's not just fighting for a seat, she's fighting against the assumptions that have always tried to dismiss her. The entitlement of someone who believes they can take what's hers because they think they can. And as the tension builds, she does something that shocks everyone in that cabin. She doesn't yell, she doesn't demand, she doesn't make a scene. She just stands there. And in that moment, she forces everyone around her, the man, the crew, the passengers, to see something they didn't even know they were blind to. This isn't just about a seat. This is about visibility. It's about the invisible systems of power that make people believe they can take what's rightfully yours without ever acknowledging the cost. Ariel Monroe walked through the bustling terminal of San Francisco International Airport, her steps deliberate, measured. each one a reflection of years of practice. She moved with a calm that wasn't just physical, but emotional. It wasn't always like this. Ariel had learned over the years how to control every step, every glance, every word, to appear calm, to appear confident, to blend in with the world around her, even though, on the inside, the world didn't always make room for her.
As the CEO of a national company, she was used to boardrooms filled with executives, crowded halls at industry conferences, and a constant stream of meetings where her opinions and decisions were respected. But today, as she made her way through the terminal, she was just another woman walking through an airport, preparing for a flight to New York. No special treatment, no VIP access. Just a woman in line for her gate, like anyone else. The towering glass windows of the terminal cast a natural light over her face, but they couldn't quite hide the subtle tension in her shoulders, the hint of wariness in her eyes. Ariel had come a long way from her humble beginnings, working hard to climb up the ladder that, at times, seemed designed to keep people like her from reaching the top. She'd earned every title, every accolade, every piece of recognition that she now carried with grace. And yet, there were moments when it all seemed fragile, moments when that carefully cultivated calm, the calm that kept her grounded, was tested by things beyond her control. Moments when the world reminded her, sometimes silently, sometimes loudly, that she wasn't always going to be given the space she'd earned. And today, she had no idea that she was about to face one of those moments. Ariel's purpose for this flight was straightforward. She was headed to the JFK Innovation Summit, where she would be delivering the keynote speech on the importance of emotional intelligence in schools, particularly for underserved communities. She had worked on this speech for months, honing it to perfection. It wasn't just any speech. It was an opportunity to speak to a group of influential leaders in education, to share her vision for a future where empathy and emotional growth were as valued as academic achievement. Ariel knew the power her words could have, the influence they could wield.
But the flight, that was supposed to be a routine part of the journey. A simple first-class seat, a quick flight from San Francisco to New York with no interruptions. Just the time to catch her breath, read through her notes one more time, and mentally prepare for what was to come. No fuss. It was meant to be just another part of her professional life, the kind of moment she had experienced countless times before. As she stepped onto the plane, though, that practiced calm of hers was tested in a way she hadn't anticipated. Her eyes briefly scanned the cabin. There it was, seat 2C, right where she was supposed to be. First class. Her seat. But it was already taken. The sight of a man lounging in her seat sent a shock through her body, not because of his presence, but because of how effortlessly he occupied that space, as if it were his own. He didn't look at her with any recognition or guilt. He didn't even seem to see her as a threat to his claim on the seat. And there it was, the first moment of tension. A moment when everything inside Ariel screamed, "This isn't right," but her practiced calm kept her grounded. She stood there for a moment, silent, calculating. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, some curious, some distracted. A quiet hum filled the cabin. The air felt thick, as if everyone sensed the shift, but no one knew how to address it. This wasn't just a seat. This wasn't just about a man who didn't understand boundaries. This was something much bigger. The flight attendants, who had been greeting passengers just moments ago, now stood frozen at the back of the cabin, unsure. How would this be handled?
Ariel, still standing in the aisle, felt the weight of the situation. Not the weight of an entitled passenger sitting in her seat, but the weight of the system that had placed him there in the first place. The subtle, underlying belief that someone like her, a black woman, successful but still under scrutiny in so many ways, wasn't supposed to be there. Not in that seat. Not in that space. The flight was supposed to be simple, straightforward. But now, the stakes were higher.
The moment she walked onto that plane, she became more than just a CEO or a woman on a business trip. She became a symbol, a reflection of the silent battles fought every day by people like her who didn't just have to prove their worth, but had to demand it, often with their silence as the loudest form of resistance. This moment would be more than just about her. It would be about everyone watching, both in the cabin and outside it. It would be about those who had been made to feel invisible, like they didn't deserve the space they had earned. It would be about how the smallest moments, like a man sitting in a seat that isn't his, can make people reevaluate what they believe to be true about entitlement, power, and respect. And what happened next would set a new course, not just for Ariel, but for anyone watching. In the air, online, everywhere. The hum of the airplane engines filled the cabin, a steady, comforting sound, almost as if it were lulling everyone into a sense of serenity. The soft overhead lighting bathed the passengers in a gentle glow, the muted hum of conversation and the clinking of drink carts blending seamlessly into the background. The scent of new leather mingled with the faint hint of fresh air, an artificial fragrance that, for a moment, tricked the senses into believing this would just be another flight, easy, uneventful, something to get through without much thought.
Ariel Monroe stepped into the plane, taking in the familiar atmosphere of first class. The plush seats, the warmth of the cabin, the faint scent of luxury that filled the air. She had been here countless times before. For someone in her position, this was where she belonged. She had worked tirelessly for years to carve out her space in the world, and this was a symbol of everything she had earned. But today, as she made her way down the aisle, that sense of comfort seemed distant. The weight of something unspoken hung in the air, a palpable tension that Ariel couldn't quite put her finger on. Something wasn't right. She walked past the rows of first-class seats, her gaze sweeping over the familiar faces, some of them looking up at her, some absorbed in their own quiet worlds. Her fingers grazed the armrests, and she paused briefly at the front of the cabin where her seat was located, 2C, right by the window. But then her eyes caught something that made her blood run cold. There he was. A white man, mid-40s, casually reclining in her seat, his body sprawled out as though he had been there for hours. His face was relaxed, his eyes half closed, as if he had already settled in for the long flight. In his hand was a glass of red wine, swirling lazily, as though he was in no rush to get anywhere. But what hit Ariel wasn't just the sight of him taking her seat, it was the way he sat there. He wasn't just occupying the space, he was owning it. His legs were stretched out, his posture wide, his body relaxed in a way that made it clear he had no intention of moving, no intention of acknowledging that someone else had rightfully claimed that space. It wasn't the mistake of a traveler who hadn't checked their seat. This was the entitlement of someone who didn't think he needed to. His eyes didn't meet hers when she approached, and there was no recognition in his expression, just a faint flicker of irritation when he saw her standing there. He didn't seem surprised. He didn't seem concerned. He simply expected that his presence in her seat was the natural order of things. Ariel's heart tightened, but she took a deep breath, her feet steady as she stood there, still for a moment. She felt the rising wave of frustration welling up inside her, but she suppressed it. This was her seat. This was her space. She stepped forward, her movements calm yet firm, the practiced composure of a woman who had faced far worse battles than this. She cleared her throat, speaking softly but with undeniable authority. "Excuse me, I believe that's my seat." The man barely looked up from his glass, his expression flat, as though he was annoyed at the interruption. He gave a dismissive wave of his hand, gesturing to the rear of the plane. "Coach is back there," he said.
the words falling out of his mouth without thought, as if dismissing her claim on the space was the most natural thing in the world. Ariel's blinked, the sharp sting of the words hitting her, but she didn't flinch. This wasn't the first time she had been dismissed like this. It wasn't the first time someone had assumed she didn't belong, or that her presence wasn't important enough to be acknowledged. It wasn't the first time a white man had thought he had the right to take something that belonged to her, as if she were invisible. But today?
Today was different. Today, she wouldn't let it slide. Her mind flashed back to the countless other moments, the subtle slights, the moments where she had been made to feel smaller, less important, as though she didn't matter. But those moments, though painful, had built something inside her, something stronger, something more defiant. Today, she would not back down. Today, she would not be silent. She looked at him, standing tall, her voice now steady with a quiet power. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't shout. There was no need for theatrics. She simply said again, "This is my seat." The man shifted uncomfortably in the seat, his eyes finally meeting hers, but there was no apology in them. No recognition of his mistake, just the faintest flicker of annoyance, the kind that came when someone was challenged in a way they didn't expect. For a moment, nothing happened. The passengers in the cabin shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and the flight attendants lingered at the back, watching but not intervening. Ariel could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, the suffocating air of tension that seemed to swell in the small space of the cabin. But Ariel didn't look away, she didn't break her gaze. She stood there, unwavering, as the realization hit the man. He had no choice but to move. This was more than just a seat. This was about power, about respect, and about the fight to claim the space that was rightfully hers, even when the world seemed to tell her she didn't deserve it.
The fight wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But in the quiet space between their exchange, Ariel Monroe made one thing very clear to everyone in the cabin. She wasn't going to let anyone take what was hers, not today, not ever again. And with that, the moment had shifted, the plane had shifted, and nothing would ever be the same again. The tension inside the cabin hung thick, like a storm about to break. The quiet hum of the engines faded into the background as the situation escalated. Ariel stood, unwavering in the aisle, the only sign of emotion being the subtle tightening of her jaw, her eyes locked on the man who had taken her seat. He had returned to his drink, his fingers lazily swirling the wine in his glass, a small smirk playing at the corners of his lips as if he had already won. He looked up for just a moment, the briefest flicker of recognition passing through his eyes, but as quickly as it appeared, it disappeared. He wasn't interested in the woman standing before him. He wasn't interested in the fact that she had a right to that seat. Ariel's presence, the steady, unwavering force of a woman who had fought every day of her life to carve out a space for herself, did more than any words could. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't need to. Her presence alone made the air feel heavier, as though the entire cabin could sense the power of her stillness. It was a quiet kind of strength, one that was rooted in years of experience, years of learning how to stand firm in the face of disrespect, to hold her ground without ever flinching. The man looked up once more, his gaze lingering on her for a moment. A brief flicker of discomfort, the kind that someone who has been caught out might feel. But it wasn't enough. He didn't care enough to back down. He didn't respect enough to apologize. He just returned to his wine, the glass swirling in his hand, as if the exchange meant nothing.
Ariel didn't move. She stood there, quiet, but her very presence seemed to draw the space around her tighter. This was more than a seat dispute. This was a reckoning, an invisible battle for recognition, for respect. The silence between them wasn't just uncomfortable, it was deafening. Ariel could feel the weight of every eye in the cabin beginning to settle on her, but still, she didn't flinch. She was calm, composed, and unyielding. But the moment was not hers alone to hold. Lena, the flight attendant, approached with a hesitance in her step. There was no rush in her movements, no urgency in her approach. She wasn't sure what to do, wasn't sure how to navigate this moment that had spiraled far beyond a simple seating error. Her voice trembled just slightly as she asked, "Is there a problem here?" The words didn't carry authority, but confusion. Lena's eyes flickered between Ariel and the man in her seat, the very picture of uncertainty. She had been trained to handle disruptions, to de-escalate conflict, but this was different. It wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. It was about power. It was about the assumption that someone like Ariel, a woman, black, dignified in her silence, could be dismissed so easily. Lena's hesitation was palpable, her uncertainty felt by everyone around her. The growing discomfort in the cabin seemed to magnify the longer Lena stood there, unsure of how to proceed. Ariel could feel the weight of it, the eyes of everyone in the cabin now slowly shifting toward the confrontation, like a slow-motion ripple across water. Ariel's strength was quiet but powerful. As the flight attendant hesitated, Ariel pulled out her phone, her fingers moving with deliberate slowness as she typed a message. "Seat issue. Guy refuses to move. Not escalating, but it's happening again." The words she typed weren't for anyone else to see, not even Lena, but for herself, a confirmation that she was not backing down. This moment would not be dismissed, not today. She knew what was at stake now. The stakes were far higher than a mere seat on a plane. This was a battle, albeit quiet, for her dignity.
The silence lingered. The tension began to bubble beneath the surface. Behind her, the whispers started. Some passengers exchanged glances, unsure whether to get involved, while others simply pretended not to notice, their eyes darting to the window or the overhead compartments. But it wasn't the small murmurs of curiosity that mattered. What mattered was that Ariel knew. The tension in the air had shifted. This wasn't just about a seat. It wasn't just a simple misunderstanding of who had the right to be in the first-class section. It was about everything that came with it. The entitlement of a man who assumed that his presence in that seat, his very existence, gave him dominion over a space that was supposed to be shared equally. It was about privilege, the privilege to take what he wanted without consequence, without even realizing the weight of what he was doing. But most of all, it was about the assumption that Ariel didn't belong in that seat, that somehow the space she had earned, the right to take her place, was not hers by default. Ariel's resistance was quiet, but it had already begun to ripple outward. The passengers, who had once been neutral observers, now found themselves silently taking sides. Some looked away, choosing the safety of their indifference. Others started to whisper amongst themselves, the air in the cabin growing thicker with each passing second. What began as an internal battle inside Ariel was slowly becoming an external confrontation, one that was impossible to ignore.
In that moment, it wasn't just about Ariel. It wasn't just about a woman fighting for her space. It was about everyone else in the room, forced to reckon with the discomfort of what was happening, forced to ask themselves, what would I do in her shoes? Ariel's calmness, her refusal to let the situation escalate into something louder, made the moment feel all the more powerful. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to make a scene. The gravity of her silence was more than enough. But the man in her seat? He had no idea that he wasn't just fighting over a seat. He was fighting a system that had been designed to keep people like Ariel invisible. And as the minutes ticked on, it became clear. This wasn't a simple seating issue. It was a collision of perceptions, of power, of what it meant to claim a space in the world. And no one was going to walk away from this moment unchanged. As the tension in the cabin simmered, the situation seemed destined to resolve itself, one way or another. The flight attendants remained on the sidelines, caught between the pressure of doing the right thing and the discomfort of intervening. The man, still lounging in Ariel's seat, had begun to grow visibly agitated, muttering under his breath. A few passengers exchanged glances, unsure of what would happen next. And then, just when it seemed like the moment had reached its peak, something unexpected happened. The captain's voice rang out through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're experiencing a slight delay due to a seat allocation issue.
We ask for your patience as we resolve this situation. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Thank you." A collective sigh of disbelief passed through the cabin. The captain's announcement seemed to break the spell for a moment. The man in Ariel's seat glanced up at the overhead panel, his annoyance flaring for the first time. He muttered under his breath, still pretending to be the wronged party. But Ariel wasn't done yet. Her calm demeanor hadn't cracked, not once, but this was no longer about just standing her ground. It was about something deeper. The man, still refusing to acknowledge his mistake, looked over at the flight attendants. "I have a meeting in New York. Can't you get this over with?" His voice was sharp, dismissive, and the words echoed through the cabin. The flight attendants exchanged a look, their earlier hesitation still visible, but this time something had shifted. Lena, the same attendant who had been uncertain before, took a deep breath and finally walked over to the man. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, Ariel spoke up, cutting through the tension. "I'm not asking him to leave my seat. I'm telling you it's my seat, and I'm asking you to do something about it." Her words were calm, yet they carried a weight that rippled through the cabin, the silence now so thick it almost felt suffocating. The moment stretched out for what seemed like an eternity. The eyes of the passengers shifted from Ariel to the man in her seat, and back to Ariel. No one said a word, but everyone was watching. Everyone felt the moment shift. Lena, still unsure, glanced at the other attendant, whose eyes flicked back to Ariel, then to the man. Ariel's presence was undeniable. The man, now visibly irritated, shot her a look, but Ariel stood tall, unmoving. She wasn't just fighting for a seat anymore. She was fighting for her right to be seen.
And then, the twist that no one saw coming. The flight attendant, Lena, turned to the man in the seat and without another word told him, "Sir, you need to vacate this seat immediately." The room went silent. The words hung in the air. For a brief moment, the man seemed confused, stunned even. He blinked rapidly, as though trying to process the fact that the flight attendant was standing up for Ariel. His entitlement had led him to believe that he could disregard the basic rules of the flight. But now, the rules had shifted. "I'm not going anywhere. I'm not moving for her. You can't make me." The man's voice rose in anger, and for a moment it seemed like he might escalate things further. But that wasn't the twist. Just as the tension reached its peak, the unexpected happened. The captain's voice cut in again, this time with an even more authoritative tone. "Sir, I'm afraid we've already made arrangements for you to be moved to a different seat. This issue has already been escalated to the head office. You'll be required to leave the first-class cabin. If you resist, we will have no choice but to call for security upon landing." A cold, stunned silence fell over the cabin. The man's face drained of color, the realization dawning on him that this wasn't just a momentary inconvenience. It was something bigger than his sense of entitlement. For the first time, he seemed to understand that this wasn't going to go away quietly. The rules had shifted, and he was now on the losing side.
He opened his mouth to protest again, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he shot a glance at Ariel, this time not with disdain, but with uncertainty. A small, almost imperceptible shift in his posture signaled that he knew he had lost. The man stood, grumbling under his breath, and reluctantly grabbed his bag. With one last defiant look at Ariel, he moved to the rear of the cabin, his departure quiet but somehow louder than any words he could have said. As the man disappeared from view, a heavy exhale of relief seemed to wash over the cabin. The passengers, who had been holding their breath, slowly began to sit back in their seats. Whispers rippled through the rows, some of approval, others of disbelief. Ariel didn't look back at the man. She didn't need to. She remained standing, her back straight, her head held high, as though nothing had changed, though everything had. She didn't need to say anything more. Her silent victory had already spoken for itself. But the real twist came next. As the flight attendants began to resume their duties, Lena approached Ariel. This time, her steps were more confident, her demeanor more respectful. She looked at Ariel, eyes wide with quiet admiration. "You handled that with a lot of grace," Lena said softly. "Thank you for your patience." Ariel gave her a nod, offering a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Thank you," she said. "Sometimes patience is the loudest answer."
The twist wasn't just in the confrontation. It was in the shift of power. It wasn't just about a woman reclaiming a seat. It was about the shift in the system, where Ariel's silent, dignified resistance had forced everyone around her, passengers, flight crew, even the entitled man himself, to acknowledge something they had ignored. Her presence wasn't just a challenge to him, it was a challenge to the norms that allowed this behavior to persist. As the plane finally took off, the cabin settled into an uneasy calm. Ariel looked out the window, the city lights of San Francisco growing distant below. The battle for the seat had been won, but the true victory lay in what had been quietly shifted in the hearts and minds of everyone who had witnessed it. It wasn't just a fight over a seat anymore. It was a moment of quiet resistance, of empowerment, and the realization that sometimes the most powerful statement isn't the loudest one. It's the one that sits, still and unwavering, in the face of everything that tries to knock you down. And Ariel knew this was just the beginning. Time seemed to stretch, slowing down as if the entire world was suspended in that one moment. The cabin, once filled with the hum of passengers settling in and flight attendants making their rounds, was now thick with the kind of tension that could be felt in the air. Every movement seemed amplified, every shift in weight, every turn of the head. The silence in the cabin wasn't empty, it was charged, a deliberate stillness hanging between Ariel and the others.
Ariel stood, her feet planted firmly in the aisle, her posture steady, unyielding. It wasn't that she was waiting for something to happen. She had already made her stand. She wasn't retreating or stepping back into the shadows. No, Ariel Monroe wasn't the type to let a moment like this slip away. She stood there, with all the quiet strength she had gathered over the years. Her body was still, but her mind raced, processing everything that had just happened. The sound of her own heartbeat pulsed in her ears as she watched the man leave, his muttered curses growing fainter with every step. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't needed to. But the silence that followed her confrontation was no ordinary silence. It was a kind of quiet power. She allowed the weight of the moment to settle in, not rushing for resolution, but letting the stillness speak for her. Every second that passed without a word from her only solidified her resolve. She wasn't backing down. She wasn't going anywhere. The flight attendants, who had been caught in the tension of the moment, now flitted about the cabin, their steps hesitant, as if unsure of what was coming next. Lena, the flight attendant who had tried to play the peacemaker earlier, exchanged a quick, anxious glance with Sean, the second attendant. It was a fleeting moment, but in it, something was understood. Their eyes said more than words could. This wasn't just about a seating issue. It was about something bigger, something far more uncomfortable. Lena and Sean's internal struggle was palpable. They were both trained to keep things smooth and orderly, to handle situations swiftly and quietly. But this wasn't just a mistake to fix. This was a subtle clash of power and entitlement that they couldn't smooth over with a polite smile or a gentle reminder of the rules. They knew it. This was about respect. And not just Ariel's respect, but the respect that had been denied for years, for decades. They had witnessed the small, insidious moments of disregard that built up to this. Moments where someone like Ariel, someone who had fought tooth and nail to earn her place, would be seen as less than, simply because of the way she looked or where she came from.
The tension in the cabin mounted, slowly but unmistakably. The usual quiet hum of the airplane felt louder now, like the sound of an impending storm on the horizon. The passengers, once absorbed in their own worlds, began to stir. Some looked at their watches, waiting for the flight to continue. Others exchanged glances, unsure of what to say, but feeling the weight of what had just unfolded. Some passengers, who had once been silent observers, now seemed to shift uncomfortably in their seats. They, too, were waiting. Waiting for something more to happen. Waiting for a resolution, a signal from the crew, anything to break the tension. But it wasn't just a matter of fixing the immediate issue. It was about the long, uncomfortable pause that came after a confrontation like that. The fact that Ariel hadn't shouted or caused a scene only intensified the effect of her silence. Her silence wasn't surrender. No, it was strength. A quiet, dignified stand that reverberated through the cabin, through the people around her. She wasn't asking for permission. She wasn't waiting for someone to tell her it was okay to be seen, to take up space. She had already claimed her space, and she wasn't giving it up. As the seconds ticked on, the stillness became almost unbearable. It wasn't uncomfortable just for Ariel. It was uncomfortable for everyone. The flight crew, the passengers, even the man who had been seated in Ariel's spot. Everyone was now in the wake of her actions. Some were beginning to question what they had witnessed, what it meant. Ariel's quiet resistance had sparked something that couldn't be easily undone, and in the midst of that silence, she stood firm, letting it build around her like an invisible force field. As her eyes glanced down at her phone, a message popped up from Amani, her legal advisor. Legal on standby. Please stay calm. You're not alone. The words weren't just a lifeline. They were a reminder of the support she had, the allies standing behind her. Amani's reassurance brought a calmness to Ariel's chest, a sense of grounding in the chaos of the moment. But it wasn't just reassurance she felt. It was the quiet confidence that she was not in this alone. This fight, this moment, was bigger than just her. The message reminded her that this wasn't some isolated incident. She wasn't fighting just for herself. She was standing in defiance of an entire system that had made others feel invisible, unworthy. And her silence? It wasn't just her refusal to argue. It was her way of saying, I belong here. My presence is as valid as anyone else's. But there was no room for backtracking now. There was no turning back. The flight was still delayed, but Ariel's fight for that seat, for her dignity, had already shifted the energy in the cabin. The weight of time was still hanging in the air, but Ariel was no longer just a passenger. She was a witness to the injustice of the world, and in that quiet moment, she had forced everyone to confront it. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. The passengers were still, waiting for something to break the tension, to resolve it. But the moment had already passed. The shift had happened. Ariel's quiet power had already made its mark. The tension that had built over the last few minutes seemed to pause in midair as the doors to the cockpit opened. The captain's presence, steady and commanding, cut through the charged atmosphere like a blade. There was no fanfare as he entered, no dramatic pause, just a calm assurance in his every step. He was a seasoned veteran, someone who had likely navigated countless disturbances with the kind of ease that only comes with years of experience. His eyes briefly scanned the cabin, landing on the passengers who had watched, some in discomfort, some in quiet judgment, others with a dawning awareness of what had just transpired. Then his gaze landed squarely on Ariel and the man in her seat. He stepped forward, his voice low but authoritative, cutting through the rising tension like a beacon of clarity. "Let's make this simple," he said, the calm in his tone both reassuring and commanding. "I need boarding passes from both of you."
The words hung in the air, simple and precise, yet they carried the weight of everything that had come before. They were not just about checking tickets, they were about acknowledging the injustice that had unfolded, the shifting of power in the most subtle yet significant way. Ariel didn't need to speak. She didn't need to explain herself. Her presence, quiet and composed, had already spoken volumes. The captain's words were simply the formal acknowledgement that this moment, this fight for her dignity, was not going to be ignored. The man in seat 2C, still lounging arrogantly as though the rules didn't apply to him, reacted as if he had just been jolted awake. The smugness that had once defined his posture quickly began to falter. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his earlier bravado fading into a thin veneer of confusion. "He flies this route every week," he huffed, his voice edged with frustration. "It must be a mistake." His words, dripping with entitlement, hung in the air like a defense that wasn't even worthy of being heard. But the captain, unflinching, was resolute. "No, sir, your seat is 4D. That's final." There was no room for negotiation in his voice. The man could argue, could attempt to assert his position, but the captain's response was a quiet declaration of authority, one that left no room for excuses. Chase's face flushed, a deep shade of red spreading across his cheeks as the realization of his defeat began to settle in. His shoulders slumped slightly, his chest puffed up less in anger now, and more in a reluctant acceptance of the situation. He opened his mouth to argue again, but was cut short by the captain's unwavering stance. The captain's eyes never wavered from Chase's, his posture solid and firm. With a final, reluctant grunt, the man in 2C stood, muttering curses under his breath as he grabbed his bag and stomped toward the back of the plane. He didn't look at Ariel again, his pride too bruised for that, but Ariel didn't need his acknowledgement. She had already won. And in that moment, Ariel's quiet victory was complete. She didn't smile. She didn't even acknowledge the small victory with a nod or a glance. She simply took her seat, her rightful seat, without fanfare. Her hands rested on the armrests, her posture regal in its silence. There was no need for a triumphant gesture. The moment spoke for itself. The victory wasn't in the words spoken, nor in the physical act of reclaiming her seat.
It was in the silence that followed. Ariel's unspoken declaration of her right to exist in the space she had earned. Her dignity was hers to hold, and no one was going to take that from her. Not today, not ever again.
As Chase moved past her, the subtle shift in the room was palpable. The murmur of conversations, previously stifled by tension, began to rise again, but it was different now. The silence in the cabin was replaced by a buzz, a collective exhale of relief mixed with the unmistakable sense of something having changed. The quiet resistance of one woman, her dignity in her silence, had become the loudest message in the room. It was no longer just about a seat. It was about the power to stand your ground without ever needing to raise your voice. The passengers around her, those who had witnessed the confrontation, now exchanged knowing glances. Some offered small nods of approval, others simply stared ahead. But there was an unspoken recognition in the air. The unyielding calm of Ariel's presence had rippled through the cabin, a shift in the power dynamics that had left a permanent mark. For those who had been silently watching, this wasn't just a fight over a seat. It was a reminder that sometimes the most powerful act is the quietest. The power was not in the arguments or the drama. It was in the resolute silence of someone who refused to be invisible, who demanded to be seen even when the world tried to look past her. As the plane continued its course, the hum of the engines now felt different. It wasn't just the sound of a flight moving toward its destination. It was the sound of a moment of change, a small but significant victory for one woman whose quiet defiance had reverberated far beyond that first-class cabin.
And as the flight attendants returned to their duties, their earlier hesitation replaced with a sense of quiet respect for what had just transpired, Ariel sat still, her gaze forward. The battle had been won, but the fight for her space, her dignity, was not over. She didn't need to say anything more. Her silence had already done the talking for her. The rest of the world would have to catch up. The world outside the window of the plane continued its slow, inevitable turn as Ariel sat quietly, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The flight from San Francisco to New York had ended, but for her, the journey was far from over. As the plane touched down on the tarmac, something else was already unfolding. A movement sparked by a moment of quiet defiance. The ripples of her actions, though subtle in their initial impact, had begun to spread far beyond the confines of the airplane cabin. A short video of Ariel's calm resistance quickly surfaced online, a candid clip of the confrontation captured by a fellow passenger, now shared by millions. At first, it seemed like just another viral moment, a fleeting piece of drama to be consumed, digested, and forgotten by the internet. But this was different. This wasn't just a moment of viral outrage. It was a statement, a challenge to the status quo, a reflection of what happens when someone quietly refuses to be overlooked. And it didn't take long for people to realize that. The video quickly racked up millions of views, shared across platforms as news outlets picked up on the story. In the aftermath, the response was overwhelming. Comments flooded in, thousands of them, some in support, others in disbelief, but all of them asking the same question. Why didn't we see this before? Why hadn't anyone stepped in? Why hadn't this been a conversation earlier? The question wasn't just about the incident on the plane, it was about everything that had led to this moment, the quiet moments of resistance, the moments where people of color, women, and marginalized communities had been pushed to the side and dismissed, often without a second thought. For many, Ariel's actions illuminated something deep. They saw her not just as a woman claiming her seat, but as a symbol for something larger, something that had been simmering beneath the surface for years, something ready to be brought into the light. It wasn't just about an entitled man sitting in the wrong seat. It was about the centuries-old patterns of power, privilege, and invisibility that had dictated who got to take up space. And Ariel, without saying a word, had challenged that system simply by standing her ground. The next day, Ariel found herself, unexpectedly, the subject of countless conversations. As the world caught fire with discussions of entitlement, privilege, and systemic injustice, Ariel, despite all the attention, found herself reflecting deeply on the significance of what had just transpired. Sitting in her quiet apartment, her mind replaying the events over and over, she began to understand that this moment, this brief confrontation on an airplane, had become something far bigger than she had ever anticipated. She sat back, the weight of her thoughts pressing on her. What did it mean to be a quiet disruptor? Ariel had always known the power of stillness, the strength of not having to shout to be heard. But today, she understood that silence wasn't always about hiding. Sometimes, silence was the loudest thing a person could do.
She whispered the words her mother had always told her when she was younger. The world doesn't give you grace, you bring your own. Her mother had said it to her in times of frustration, in times of defeat. It was a reminder that sometimes the world would not give you space, would not recognize your worth, would not acknowledge your struggles. But in those moments, you had to create your own grace. You had to make space for yourself. And that was what Ariel had done. She had claimed her space without apology, without hesitation, and in doing so had become a living embodiment of that quiet strength her mother had instilled in her. Ariel closed her eyes, remembering that quiet wisdom from her mother. It had been something that had stayed with her all these years, something she had carried with her from the boardrooms to the streets. That silent strength was her weapon. And in that moment, on that plane, she had wielded it more powerfully than she had ever realized. The impact of her defiance rippled outward, not just on social media, but within communities across the globe. She hadn't been looking for validation, hadn't been expecting the viral moment, but she knew something bigger had just been ignited. The conversation had shifted. She didn't know how big this moment would become, but as she stood there, resolute in her calm, she knew that this wasn't just a personal victory. This wasn't just about her claiming a seat on a flight. This was the beginning of a much broader movement. She hadn't set out to be a symbol, but in that moment she had become one. A symbol of resistance, a symbol of dignity, a symbol of standing up when the world expects you to remain silent.
She stood in the quiet aftermath, her resolve stronger than ever. This wasn't just a moment in time, it was the start of something much bigger. Ariel Monroe, with her quiet defiance and unwavering grace, had shifted the narrative. She had turned a simple, everyday act into a profound statement that would reverberate far beyond the confines of that flight. In the days that followed, the attention grew. More interviews, more articles, more discussions. But none of it mattered as much to Ariel as the simple realization that, in that moment, she had changed the conversation. She had shown the world that sometimes the most powerful action you can take is simply to demand your space, to make yourself visible when the world has tried to erase you. As Ariel prepared for the next phase of her journey, she knew that this was just the beginning. She had already proven that the power of silence, the strength of quiet resistance, could make waves. But now she was ready to continue that journey. She was ready to keep fighting, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. Her journey had just begun, and the world
the world would be watching. Sometimes, standing still is the loudest act of resistance. Ariel Monroe didn't just reclaim her seat. She didn't merely win a small, fleeting victory over one man in a first-class cabin. She did something far more significant. She reclaimed her place in history. A history where people like her, whose worth is often overlooked, whose voices are too often silenced, finally stood tall. In that moment, her silence wasn't passive. It was a defiant roar that shattered expectations and proved that dignity cannot be stolen, not by a man, not by a system, not by anyone who seeks to diminish the worth of another. What Ariel did wasn't just for her. It was for everyone who's been told they don't belong, for every person who's been made invisible, for those who silently bear the weight of being overlooked, misunderstood, and underestimated.
Her story isn't just a single moment of defiance. It's a call to action, a reminder that every day we are given the choice to stand for what's right, to claim our place in the world, to refuse to let others dictate our worth, to refuse to be silenced when our dignity is under attack. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the times you've been dismissed, overlooked, or even silenced, then it's time to ask yourself, what will you do the next time silence tries to steal someone's place? Will you sit back, letting the moment pass? Or will you rise to stand beside those who have been pushed down? Will you take action when the world demands you be quiet? Help us keep telling stories like this. Share this story, like, share, and subscribe. Because moments like Ariel's are the stories that need to be heard, the stories that remind us all of the power we hold when we refuse to shrink. The fight for dignity is ongoing, and we need to keep lifting up the voices that refuse to be ignored. The sky doesn't belong to the entitled. It doesn't belong to those who think they can take what isn't theirs. It belongs to everyone, to every person who's willing to stand tall, to claim their space, and to say, I belong here. Will you stand tall when your moment comes? Or will you let someone else take what's rightfully yours? The choice is yours. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine, so do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine, so do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.